Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This informational and oversight hearing of the Assembly Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee regarding California's flood control is convened. Welcome members, panelists, and the public. I'd like to note that the United States Army Corps of Engineers is here in an informational capacity only and not as part of oversight of this committee. Thank you again for being here. That said, I'm pleased to be named chair of this committee. It's an honor, and in my role, I take seriously the committee's oversight function with regard to state agency stewardship of our resources, the quality and dependability of our water supply, the condition and accessibility of our parks, the stewardship and preservation of our wildlife. These issues touch all Californians as well as future generations. The legislative and executive branch have common goals, but they are also each other's checks and balances. I would like us to challenge each other to do better. This past year, with regard to the drought, we have often heard the famous saying, never waste a good crisis. But we shouldn't wait for crises to act. That is why I'm convening this hearing on flood control now. California has a long history of alternating between periods of drought and periods of flood. According to the California Department of Water Resources, over the last 60 years, California has experienced more than 30 flood events, major flood events, resulting in more than 300 lives lost, more than 750 injuries, and billions of dollars in disaster claims. The department states that 1 in 5 Californians, over 7 million of us, live in the 500-year floodplain, and that nearly $600 billion in assets, crops, structures, and public infrastructure are exposed to flooding. With future development, population changes, climate change, the loss of major infrastructure, critical facilities, state commerce, that figure could climb much higher. So before the next flood event, whether it's this year or 5 years from now, we should understand our flood control system, who is responsible for it, and where we need to make the most strategic improvements and investments. Representatives of our key state, federal, and local agencies are here today, and my goal is to engage in a conversational roundtable-style discussion with them regarding the state of our flood control efforts and where we best need to direct our resources. This conversation is very timely. The governor's budget, released just last Friday, proposes expediting $1.1 billion in funding to DWR projects that are consistent with the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. That $1.1 billion is the entire remainder of our Proposition 1E funds. Before we proceed further, are there any members who would like to make some brief opening comments? Yes, Mr. Gallagher, thank you very much for joining us. Your district is certainly in the floodplain, and I'm glad that you can join us. Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to sit on the oversight committee hearing this morning. As a newly elected assembly member, I have a long history with flood control policy, having sat as a board member of the Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency and the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency. So very interested in these issues. And as you said, Mr. Chairman, it's very important that we take this oversight function very seriously. We have some major projects that do need to be completed in California, several urban projects, including the West Levee Feather River project, the Natomas project here just north of us, West Sacramento project, San Joaquin project. So very interested in seeing how we're going to, and hearing from the agencies on how we complete those projects and ensure that we are maximizing the Proposition 1E money and as well as the new money that would be coming through the water bond as well.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Here is how I would like to conduct today's hearing. We're going to have a short film on the flood control system. Then Ellen Hannock of PPIC will provide an overview of where we've made investments and our growing flood risk. Following any Q&A with Ellen, I would like the second panel to then come up as a group. Ellen, would you please join us?
Anywhere it rains, it can flood. And California's vast Central Valley, flat, low, and encircled by mountains, is especially at risk. Throughout its long history, the Central Valley's natural tendency was to flood. Each rainy season, winter storms dumped snow into the surrounding mountains. As the snow melted each spring, it rushed down into the valley, spilling over riverbanks and pooling for miles across the valley floor, like water in a bathtub. As pioneers settled California in the 1800s, they piled dirt along the riverbanks, forming levees, in an attempt to keep rivers from overflowing into their land. But the levees didn't always stop the floods. In high water, levees often failed or overtopped, leaving towns and farmland flooded for weeks at a time. As flood damage mounted, communities sought better protection. Beginning in the early 1900s, the state of California and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built many of the dams and bypasses that we still rely on to reduce our flood risk. Today, California has one of the world's largest systems of flood risk reduction: dams, weirs, bypasses, and thousands of miles of levees designed to keep floodwaters away from property and lives. It's called the State Federal Flood Control System. Through this system, water is carefully managed along its entire journey from the mountains to the sea. Dams and reservoirs collect rain and snowmelt flowing down from the mountains. It's then released gradually in amounts that levees downstream can hold. After heavy rains or when more water accumulates than levees can handle, weirs release it into open swaths of land called bypasses, directing floodwater away from Central Valley cities. But while our dams, levees, bypasses, and weirs help reduce the risk of flooding in the Central Valley, they are no guarantee against it. Floods took lives and caused millions of dollars in damage throughout the Central Valley in 1986 and 1997, and the region remains at risk. Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana was a grave reminder that the risk of living with levees is real. Together, the federal government, the state of California, and many local agencies are working to reduce the risk. Levee improvement projects are ongoing throughout the Central Valley, as well as improvements to Folsom Dam. We've made much progress in reducing flood risk in California in recent years. Still, living in a floodplain comes with inherent risk. Although we can never completely eliminate our risk of flooding, together we can continue to find better and smarter ways to manage and live with that risk.
Thank you very much for providing that video for us to watch to understand the threat to so many of our communities. You may begin.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to address you at your first meeting of this year, and kind of nice to switch from talking about droughts to talking about the other end of the extreme of floods, because I agree that this is something we have to keep in mind. We're only a big storm away from new flood events in California, given our topography and our climate. So I have a brief slide presentation. Is that something that we can? I think you have handouts, but just for. And what I'm going to do for you is just provide a very brief overview of some of the statistics, some of which I borrowed from a really excellent study that the Department of Water Resources and the Army Corps came out with in late 2013, and then top that off with some work that we did recently on some of the finance issues in flooding. Thank you. So that video that we just saw was great, and it's true that we are making a lot of investments right now to improve the reliability of our levees and so on. But in a sense, we also are facing growing risks, despite the fact that we're making improvements. And I want to sort of start with that. Mr. Chair, you mentioned some of the statistics of the population exposed in California and the assets exposed. And these two maps are from the Flood Futures Report. And I thought they were useful to show to you, just to highlight that, indeed, the Central Valley is a big place for both population exposed and for risk. But really, we face flood risks around the state of California. And if you look at the, if you figure that darker means more in this map, actually the most population and the most assets exposed are in coastal Southern California. So we in addition to the tremendous risks that we have and vulnerability in the Central Valley, we also have a lot of vulnerability in coastal areas. That includes the Bay Area, especially around the low-lying areas within San Francisco Bay and along the coast. And although we're improving our flood infrastructure in a lot of places, the risk is growing because of a few other factors. One of them is just population growth and the fact that as long as we know that we can't completely eliminate the risk, especially behind levees, when more people and businesses locate in those places, it just increases the potential damage when we do have a flood. So that's just a kind of a fact to always keep in mind with flood risk. And the other thing has to do with just projections of what's happening both with our climate and with sea level. So California has been facing rising sea level in our coastal areas ever since the end of the last ice age. This is something that may accelerate as the climate warms, but what that does is it increases the likelihood of storm surges, and it basically makes it more likely to have bigger flooding in coastal areas. So this is a concern along the ocean coastline, in the Bay Area, and in the Delta. It's also likely that, according to climate models, that we're going to be having more extreme weather, so more extreme droughts, more extreme floods, and warming temperatures also mean that we get less snow and more rain, and that can increase the effect of individual big storms in the winter and make it more likely to flood. So those are just a couple of things to kind of keep in mind in thinking about how we plan for our flood infrastructure. Now, the video did a great job of showing for the Central Valley the complexity of our flood management system, and this just lists a few of the different kinds of pieces of infrastructure there. And I just wanted to add one thing, and I know this has been something that has been considered a lot in the context of Central Valley flood planning, is the fact that some kinds of approaches can, in addition to improving flood protection, can yield some other benefits. And so I'm showing you here a picture of the Yolo bypass, just as one example of that. This was something that's been around since the early 20th century. It's critical to the protection of the Sacramento metro area from flooding. It turns out that it's also great from an ecosystem perspective, and it provides a lot of benefits. In that way, we're discovering that in addition to helping with birds, it's also actually a great place to raise baby salmon. And some of these kinds of bypasses can also be useful for helping to recharge the groundwater basins. So something that more and more folks are keeping in mind, also thinking about levees, setback levees. Instead of building them very close to the edge of the river, building them back a bit, it gives a bit more room for the river, which can increase the flood protection for the folks behind those levees, but it also can enhance the other benefits. So we face a lot of challenges in managing floods. There's a big investment gap. I'm going to show you that in a minute. We also, in the Central Valley, the state is liable potentially for billions of dollars in damages, and this stems from a court ruling in 2003 called the Paterno ruling, which held the state liable for the failure of a locally managed levee within the Central Valley. And that relates to the nature of the complex nature of the state-federal role in Central Valley flood protection in particular, which I think was probably one of the factors that really got folks mobilized after Hurricane Katrina to get some flood money into a bond on a ballot and ask voters to approve it. Now, the second point, the point there about flood control investments helping and not eliminating risk is what I already mentioned to you. That's especially an issue in places where we are building according to federal standards, which basically federal flood insurance standards require communities to restrict construction in places with less than protection from a 100-year flood. There are only about 4% of the population that lives in those areas that are very flood prone. But then if you have protection from that 100-year flood, which is a flood that's large enough that it has a chance of occurring, 1% chance of occurring every year, if you got better protection than that thanks to a levee, for example, then there are no restrictions, or at least under the federal law. Now, California has changed that recently for Central Valley urban areas, and I'll come back to that at the end of my talk. But just to say, if you've got that kind of a of protection, most experts think that's not enough for an urban area. And if you're still building in those places and your levee fails, you've got more damage than if you had fewer folks there. And this photo, I think, is interesting because it's the San Joaquin River near Stockton, and this is exactly the kind of place where where there's a high flood risk, a lot of folks living, and with the Paterno ruling, the state is definitely on the hook for damages in this place. The fact that we can't eliminate flood risk means that we need to complement investments with other tools like insurance, and there is federal flood insurance available. It can be quite expensive in the 100-year floodplain in the areas that are protected by for at least that amount of protection, at least 100-year protection. It's actually not that expensive, but people don't tend to use it that much. They kind of feel like, okay, I'm off the hook, I don't have to use it. And some of the recent data that DWR shared with me on flood insurance suggests that it looks like flood insurance uptake is down in California, probably because it's been dry, probably because of the recession and so on. So even in the 100-year floodplain, where folks are really should have that insurance, it looks to us like it's maybe 22% of the people living in that area have it right now. So just now, switch over a little bit to the money side and the investment gap. We did a study that came out in March last year looking at water finance for the water system as a whole, and this is a slide that just kind of gives you a big picture overview of what we're spending, who's spending money on water, California's water system, local governments, state governments, federal governments, and how much in the different sectors. And you can see that flood management is not the big ticket item in the overall scheme of things. The big ticket items are especially urban water supply and urban wastewater systems, which are vast underground systems, miles and miles and miles and miles of plumbing and treatment facilities and so on. So a little bit less than $2.2 billion annually on flood management. A big chunk of that by locals. Locals cover most of the maintenance, and they cover about half of the investment, and then the state and federal governments come in with money mostly to help with the investments. And just to kind of give you those numbers, for that period, 2008 to 2011, the federal government was providing us with about $250 million a year. The state was putting in about $575 million, and locals about $1,325,000,000. Total. So locals are raising some money for this, even though they're really relying importantly on federal and especially increasingly state help. You're looking at the GEO bonds that, in particular, Prop 1E. In 2006, November 2006, voters approved both Prop 1E, which was I think about $4.1 billion, and then there was also some funding for floods in Prop 84, which was also on that ballot. So total, we're looking at a bit less than $5 billion that was made available. This is new for California. California was not used to using GEO bonds for this purpose, and I think this really came in recognition of the fact that there was a big investment gap and that the expectation of federal cost shares. The federal policy is for any project that's authorized by and has a chief's report, and you'll probably hear more about that from subsequent speakers. Local agencies are eligible for quite a large cost share, up to 65% in some cases, but the federal government just has not had the kind of funds available to fund all the projects that would, in principle qualify for that. So that's led to a kind of a long waiting list of projects, and so the state has really stepped in to help fund there. As you mentioned, Mr. Chair, the governor now proposes in the administration's budget to spend the remaining funds from Prop 1E, $1.1 billion. That'll be a big jump compared to the typical annual state spending. That's going to be really welcome. But then when that's gone, look what's in Prop 1 that just passed. Not a whole lot. So not to diminish the value of every dollar that's there, but clearly this is not. This is going to be on the agenda soon again, I think, in terms of finding state funds to bring in the state's share. This just shows you kind of where the bond funds have gone since 2006 for flood management, a range of different kinds of things, especially levees. This is mostly in the Central Valley. That was the focus of Prop 1E in particular. And then here's the flood gap, the flood investment gap. So the DWR Army Corps report estimated that California had a flood investment need of at least $50 billion. We looked at that and kind of took out some of the funding in the Delta and kind of replaced it with some different numbers, because that included sort of thinking about flood protection for water supply, including sort of peripheral canal or tunnels. So when you instead just put in money for shoring up Delta levees and not thinking about the water supply project, that gets you to about $34 billion. Now, if we figure that it's reasonable to try to get that spent in 25 years, if we really want to address our flood risk, that gives us about $1.4 billion a year that we should be spending on investments, not counting maintenance investments. And that's the orange bar there. The dark blue bar is what we have been spending, about $600 million annually in investments. So we have to more than double that, basically. And you can see that a chunk of that is from bond funds that are almost gone. So the near-term bond funds will help, but then we're going to have to. This is ongoing, and federal funds are lagging or won't be increasing for sure in the current federal budget environment, and locals face a lot of challenges in raising these funds. Some local agencies have been successful, but they have to go to voters now. Since 1996, it's not the locally elected boards that can decide about the assessments. This has to go to voters, and it's hard to get them to approve things, especially if they already have 100-year protection. So I just want to show you the kind of comparison by region. This is a busy slide, but it's basically to say kind of compare what happens, how do we fill this gap if we use state bond funds or if we use local funds. And everybody in the local region, everybody in the county pays. Basically, California has to about double the amount of spending that we're doing at the local level in order to fill this investment gap, about $30 per person statewide. If we do it with general obligation bonds, that's the brown line. So what we're spending now is green. The brown line bar is what it would cost per region, per person annually to fill the gap with general obligation bonds. And then the orange is what it would cost if it has to be spent locally. And you can see that for the Central Valley, both for the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River regions, the orange bars are way bigger. And that's because there's a very high flood risk here, a big investment gap, not as many people, and the way that we fund general obligation bonds, it's through the state general taxes, and those are heavily skewed toward income tax. The higher incomes are in the Bay Area and in the South Coast. So you can see that the Bay Area's brown bar is bigger that way, right? It's just something to consider in terms of what's the ability to pay in different areas and what's the appropriate mix of funding. So I'm just going to end with a few thoughts on policy priorities. I think that the legislature in 2007 took some really important steps with a flood package that, for the Central Valley, that raised urban protection standards to a 200-year flood, so doubling the federal protection level, new planning tools, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, CVFPP, is a testament to that, really looking in a very sophisticated way at a lot of these issues. Ecosystem objectives are being incorporated in very creative ways. We think that the state should consider extending these reforms to other regions. As you saw in that first graph with the maps, there are big risks elsewhere in the state as well. Local agencies need more ways to raise funds, and one of the things that we suggested in our funding report was that the state could consider a regional fee enacted at the state level by the legislature and with the governor's signature that would allow funds, for example, within the Delta or within the Central Valley that would not necessarily require the local vote that Prop 218 requires for every little local agency. And then the state's going to need to prioritize the bond funding because there's just not enough to go around to all of the needs. And we think, in addition to thinking about liability issues that the state faces, that these multi-benefit approaches are especially valuable. Thank you.